Blomfield.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. After last Wednesday's budget, I was caught up in chaos at St Pancras, with most of the lines north out of action. And what was interesting was that whatever the real reason, listening to people around me talking, here we go again. Yeah. Everything's broken. Yeah. It's a reflection of so much that's happening in the country.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it does reflect that experience. Shocking NHS waiting lists. Previous progress, and this is appalling, previous progress on cancer survival rates now slipping. People unable to get a dentist, and as my right honourable friend, the Shadow Health Secretary, said in his storming critique of the government, some people resorting to pulling out their own teeth, as we heard at the Health Select Committee. Crumbling schools. I mean, in Sheffield, we have an estimated 45 million needed for essential repairs of our schools, but only 3.4 million available. Buses costing more while services decline. Youth services cut and knife crime rising. A failing welfare system which has created a massive growth in food banks. What we once thought a temporary phenomenon, now part of the welfare landscape. And local government in particular, starved of funds. Over the past 14 years, Sheffield Council has lost around half its funding from central government in real terms. A total of £3.6 billion, equivalent to 315 million less for this year's budget alone. Now, last Wednesday's budget, as the last of a dying administration, we all hope, would have been a chance to begin to repair broken Britain. But the Chancellor missed it, ignoring the crisis across our public services, ignoring too public opinion, which puts those services before tax cuts. But these weren't decisions made in the public interest. They were made to manage the warring factions inside his party. And as so many decisions over the past 14 years have been, regardless of the damage to our economy. Now, the Chancellor likes to make claims about growth rates using convenient snapshots of statistics, but look at the last quarter for which figures are published, quarter 4 of 2023, compared with 4 years earlier. 4 years earlier. Now, forget those claims about leading the G7. According to the House of Commons Library, UK growth for that quarter was 1%, well below the Eurozone, well behind Japan, Canada and the US. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research puts the UK's annual growth rate at around 1.2% since 2010, roughly half the 2.3% under most of the last Labour government. So my right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, is right to focus on growth. And there's no benefit in increasingly taxing an ever-diminishing cake. But it was interesting to hear the Shadow Secretary of State, no longer in her place, boast that UK tax as a percentage of GDP is well behind most of Europe. It is. Behind half the G7. It is. But you know, she's at odds with her Chancellor, who was looking admiringly at the US, where it's far lower, at 26.5% of GDP. But there's no evidence from the US. And this is a reflection of the flaws in the Chancellor's thinking. There's no evidence in the US that it's that tax yield that has driven growth. Indeed, if there's a lesson to be learnt from the States, it's probably from Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And tax in the US doesn't cover much of the spending that it does in the UK. Americans might have more money in their pockets, but they have to spend it on services funded by tax here, from refuse collection to health. And the US spends much more on health than we do, 14% of GDP compared with 9%. So there was, in the budget, space to increase revenue, but not to increase taxes on working people. Indeed, this budget left those who could least afford it as tax losers. According to the Resolution Foundation, workers earning below 27,000 which is just under the average earnings in South Yorkshire, will be up to £500 a year worse off because of the combined impact of the national insurance changes, which the Chancellor likes to talk about, and the threshold changes which he likes to ignore since last August. But instead, the Chancellor gave a capital gains tax handout for those selling second and third properties. His tax cuts hit those struggling most with the cost of living crisis, but they leave unprotected government departments worse off. Less money for education, less for local government, less for most departments. And there's not enough for the NHS to pay their staff the wages that they deserve. So there were choices. We could have had a budget which focused on public services and investment in growth. We could have had one that used the opportunity to raise taxes from those who could afford it, beyond simple game playing on non-doms. This budget didn't. It failed the country, as this government has for 14 years. It showed again why it's time for change and time for a general election. Yeah.